Father Richard.
Okay. Well, welcome to all of you, and a big welcome to Christena. We've been together all weekend. I just was able to give a little retreat to a group of activists and would-be contemplatives in Santa Fe, and Christena was able to be a part of that. So we feel like we're sort of already, I hope, I certainly am, wanting to be on one another's wavelength. But I do want to start by telling you, well, at least a little bit of why I trust her so much and why I'm really eager to have this dialogue. Michael mentioned her book, Disunity in Christ. But I just want to read for you some of the titles of each chapter are good enough, but the subtitles are even better. Well, the first chapter is Right Christian, Wrong Christian. Didn't we? A lot of us start there. You were one or the other. There was no in between. So already there you see why the work I've done with what I call non-dual thinking. I believe Christena takes this to the pastoral, practical, racial, national level, we're all political level where we live. But some of the other subtitles. How categorizing distorts how we see each other. Chapter 4, how categorizing pollutes our interactions with each other. 5, how the groups we form protect our identity and self-esteem. I hope you get to unpackage that a little bit. That's so true, I think. 6, how bias boosts our self-esteem. That's what we're going to be talking about in July, the whole scapegoat mechanism. You know. How cultural threat leads to hostile conflict. How our culture clouds our judgment. How things can and should be. That's chapter 10 subtitle, and in many ways I think inspires the title that we gave to this particular webcast, Imagining a Different Future. So I'm going to hand it over to you, Christena, and you say as much as you want, and I'll just try to respond to that, which will probably be easy. So thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Father Richard. An African parable. There once was a monkey who lived on an island. And this island experienced a terrible, terrible monsoon, and the monkey barely survived. He only survived by climbing to the tallest tree on the island and grabbing onto the branch and just holding on for dear life. And as the monsoon subsided, he looked down into the water because the tree was kind of overlooking the water, and he saw a little tiny fish struggling again, trying to swim against the current. And this fish clearly looked like it was barely making it. And the monkey was of kind heart. And so the monkey decided, I'm going to go save this fish. So the monkey climbed out onto the branch, the furthest branch, at great risk to his own life, right? He's very heroic. He climbs out and swoops down into the water and snatches the fish to save it from the current. And then he puts the fish on dry land. And at first the fish seems very excited and grateful and is flapping around with gratitude. But then it settles into a peaceful, deep sleep. This is a parable that is, yes, a little bit morbid, but it really guides the way that I think about action and contemplation. One of the things that I think about a lot as a social psychologist and as a practical theologian is, how do our particularities, how do our distinctives, how do our differences impact our oneness? And so many of us who spend time in the contemplative practices are seeking oneness. And we want to be in relationship with the other, but what does that look like? And how can it be something that is honoring to both of us and also lifts all of us up? And this parable is so endearing to me because the monkey was a really good monkey. The monkey cared. The monkey wanted to make a difference. The monkey wanted to connect. The monkey noticed the fish. I mean, there were so many beautiful things about this monkey. But the monkey also did not have a sociological imagination. The monkey did not recognize that the monkey was distinct from the fish, that the monkey had an identity that was different than the fish, that the monkey had an experience in the world that was different than the fish's experience in the world, that the monkey had power and agency that the fish did not have. And so without that sociological imagination, without understanding, where am I located in our social world relative to others, then we can't actually be one when we seek it. And actually, when we do try to be one, sometimes we end up hurting each other, dishonoring each other, even killing each other, which is the opposite of our goal as contemplatives, as those of us who follow the Christian tradition. And so I think about this and I think, gosh, there are some serious limitations to good intentions, especially when we're blind to the ways in which some of these social processes are impacting us. And I also think about our God who is 3 in 1, and the ways in which the Trinity only works because there's a distinctiveness, that in the midst of that unity, there are 3 distinct characters, there are 3 distinct persons, and they have to show up in the Trinity as distinct in order for the Trinity to even work. If the creator is just like the liberator, then the Trinity doesn't work. If the spirit comforter is just like the creator, then the Trinity doesn't work. They have to be who they are individually. But what's really interesting is that we have our own inability to see difference because it threatens us more often than not. And I especially want to hone in on the ways that we're threatened by difference across power lines. What happens when I see someone walking down the street who seems to be less well off than me, who seems to be struggling in a way that I am, that I'm not, who seems to be experiencing life in a way that's different than me? How do I respond? How does my ego respond in that situation? And I found that more often than not, even when I have the best intentions, I tend to want to pretend like we're all the same. I want to just say, I don't need to notice the particularities of their experience. I don't need to listen well and try to get a sense of how they're interacting with the world. And I often make assumptions. I make assumptions about why they're in their predicament, why they're struggling. And it's usually because they're just not as awesome as I am, right? I mean, the reason why I'm so well situated in the world, the reason why I don't maybe need help, although we often think of not needing help as like a spiritual, like a fruit of the spirit or something. It's really counter to everything that we should believe. But because of my ego, I want to interpret the situation in a way that flatters me. And so I might think, well, I'm, more hardworking, or I have better character, and I am able to save, or I'm able to stay in a job that I don't like because I have, just a good work ethic. And we do these things because social psychologists have found that, we don't exactly know what self-esteem is. As a matter of fact, there have been massive fights within the field on what it actually is. Some people think it's affective, it's how I feel about myself. Some people think it's cognitive, it's what I think about myself. The only thing we seem to agree on is that it's really, really necessary. We will go to any length to preserve it. And for those of us in North America, we're pretty good at preserving it. We're pretty good at feeling good about ourselves. On average, North Americans have a self-esteem of about a 7 on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the highest. And so we do feel good about ourselves, and we do this by engaging in self-serving biases. That's what we call them, and they're basically just the ways in which we interpret situations to make us look good, exactly like I would do, if I see someone who has less power than me in our society. And as I approach that situation, I'm not thinking about the broader societal structures that impact people's lives, right? It's easy for me to think, well, I have agency, and I have some money, and I have some upward mobility, and I have a stable job because I've worked so hard, because I'm so amazing, because I finished my dissertation, all of these things. And sometimes I talk with my students about sociological imagination. What does it look like to evaluate where we're located in the social world and really take a critical look towards it? And I'll say, I get invited to come speak. I get invited to be on webcasts. I get invited to write books. I get invited to write for magazines. And I have neighbors who don't have my education, who don't have my upward mobility, and they have more astute observations about our world than I do. How come no one gives them an opportunity? And then my students say, well, Dr. Cleveland, you deserve to have more of a voice than everybody else. You deserve to be the monkey who has agency, who has power, who's able to save herself because you've worked so hard. And I think, well, I did work hard. I will give you credit. I mean, I will say that. It's true. I was there for all those all-nighters. I was there for what I did. But I have to also think about the world in which I was born into. And I have, and we all do. We all have unique stories. And my story is really unique. My parents are really only passionate about two things, Jesus and education. And so we started studying for the SATs when I was in first grade because they wanted us to be prepared to go to college. My dad went to Yale and his brother went to Princeton. And so they decided we're going to raise our kids in a way that sets them on a path to go to these schools. And so I came home from school every day and had my regular homework. And then on top of it, had an hour and a half of extra homework that my dad gave me to do every single day. And I wasn't aware that I was studying for the SATs at the time, but then when I did take the SATs, I was like, wow, this is all remarkably familiar. And I'm actually quite good at analogies and reading comprehension. And my parents did other things like they wanted us to be cultured. And so we had season tickets to the San Francisco Opera and ballet and symphony. And twice a month we would dress up as a family and go and have these very enriching experiences. And they lied to us and told us that the only thing open in the summer was the library. And so we believed it, right? School's closed, everything must be closed. And so it wasn't until I was in fifth grade that I even realized that there was an amusement park 20 minutes from our house, and that's where everybody else went in the summer. And when I was in third grade, my parents signed us up for Saturday Science Academy at UC Berkeley. And so I got on the BART train every day and spent all day in a lab at UC Berkeley, and I got comfortable being on college campuses. And my dad went to Yale, and so we had Yale everything in our house. Yale suitcases, Yale towels, Yale toothbrushes, you name it, everything said Yale. And every night at dinner, we had to recite the 8 Ivy League schools for my dad so that he knew that we knew where we were going to college, right? And so was it a surprise when I got into a bunch of schools and ended up matriculating at Dartmouth? No. I was Dartmouth bound from the moment that I was conceived. Was it a surprise that getting into Dartmouth set me up to get into a top PhD program, which set me up to be a professor at Duke, which set me up to get book contracts and have a voice and be the monkey in our world who has agency and power and the ability to climb wherever I want and the ability to try to fix other people's problems? No, it's not a surprise. And once those of us who have access to this world of the upwardly mobile, the world of the formally educated or other forms of groups in our society that have more agency, like whites or men or Christians or people who speak English or people who are American nationals, all of us benefit from our location. And so many of us can't say that we earned every last bit of it. Yes, I did work hard, but in every way that I worked hard, society was there supporting me because I was born into a family where 2 parents went to college. And for those of us who are white, in every way that we worked hard in society, we had society supporting us relative to people who were born with brown skin or people who were born in different countries or people who don't speak English. And so we have to notice this. If we want to be one, right? If we want to enjoy this multicultural world, we have to notice this. We can't be like the monkey and just pretend like the differences don't matter. But our self-esteem gets in the way, our ego gets in the way because we want to believe that we deserve everything. We want to believe that our agency is a result of our hard work or our personal characteristics. We want to believe that this difference, this chasm that we see between us and them is not due to us, it's due to them. And so we often don't listen well. We don't take the time to say, wow, okay, I'm gonna recognize I'm a monkey. I experience the world in a certain way. I experience the world in ways that support the work that I do more often than not. Doesn't mean my life is perfect. Maybe I'll weather storms too, just like the fish will. but my likelihood of survival is a lot higher than the fish's. And so what does that mean? How do I be one with the fish? I look to Jesus, who is such a great teacher in so many ways. And like I say, Jesus is this member of the Trinity. Jesus got to experience this unity in the midst of particularity. Jesus got to experience the mutuality of the Trinity. And Jesus got to show up as Jesus, as the liberator, and also be in deep relationship with the Creator and with the Comforter, and to be part of this sort of interdependent relationship that didn't make sense. It didn't make sense outside of that context. And when we see Jesus coming to earth to spend time with us in the Incarnation, Jesus brings this concept of interdependence and mutuality with him as he seeks oneness with us on earth. And Paul talks about this in such beautiful ways in Philippians 2, when he talks about Jesus leaving, not really leaving the Trinity, because Jesus was always still part of the Trinity, but certainly engaging with us as a human. And he talks about Jesus emptying himself of his privilege and his power so he could be one with us, so he could be human. And that eventually led to the cross. And for me as a social psychologist, and I'm pretty scientific and focused on the here and the now, it's hard for me to wrap my head around this idea of incarnation, this idea of kenosis, Jesus emptying himself of his power, certainly on a metaphysical level, because I don't know, I can imagine it, I can try to make sense of it, but ultimately I'm like, what does that mean for me, right? What does that mean for me practically? I can't really cross metaphysical planes in order to be with people. So if I'm a monkey and there are fish out there, what does it look like for me? And so I've taken a deep dive into the Gospels to see, okay, so Jesus definitely came to earth, but then what did Jesus do when he was on earth as a human being, interacting with us? How did Jesus empty himself? How did Jesus cross this difference between the powerful and the less powerful? How did Jesus understand himself in his context? Did Jesus have a sociological imagination? And so I've applied this hermeneutic to the Gospels, and I've been studying, looking to see, what does Jesus do in social situations where he has power and other people don't? How does he become one with those around him? How does he empty himself of his power and his privilege? And I dare you to look through the Gospels with that hermeneutic, because the thing is Jesus definitely had a sociological imagination. Didn't preach a sermon about it, but if you look at his behaviors, it's so obvious that he knew exactly where he was located in the social world relative to other people around him. And you see it all the time. 3 of the Gospels talk about Jesus so beautifully interacting with Jairus, the leader of the synagogue, and also this woman who was bleeding. And here you see such a wide spectrum. Like, talk about monkey and fish, right? Jairus had all the power. He was a respected leader. He was male. He had a voice. He was the one that people listened to. And Jesus played a similar role. Jesus had a lot of power too. In some ways, he was very oppressed, but in other ways, he had a lot of voice and privilege in his society. He was Jewish and not Samaritan. He was male and not female. He was free and not slave. And so, here we have the scenario where we have Jesus, a person of great influence. There are crowds all over the place wanting to be with him. And then we have Jairus, who's another person of great power and influence, who comes and says, "Will you please heal my daughter?" And so Jesus is on his way to go heal Jairus' daughter. And as a millennial, I think, well, of course, yeah, his Twitter feed's gonna blow up, right? He's healing not just beggars, but he's healing the important people's kids. Like, this is good for an up and coming minister, right? If you think about it like in a very pragmatic way, which I'm not me. But then you see all these crowds where people want to be with Jesus, and Jesus is on his way to go heal Jairus, and then this woman who has no voice, no power, is sick which according to lots of different Jewish theologies meant that she was a bad person. So even another reason for people to say, well, she deserves what she got, like her situation is totally her fault. The fact that she's been marginalized in our society, the fact that she's struggling, that's completely her fault. We don't even really need to talk to her. She comes and as a person of faith touches the hem of Jesus's cloak, and it says immediately she was healed. So the miracle was done. There was no need to do anything. There was no need to stop and say anything, but Jesus stops and says something. And he says, who touched me? And even his disciples are like, that's the dumbest question ever. There are thousands of people touching you, right? So why would Jesus ask that question? Why would Jesus say, who touched me? It's because Jesus had a sociological imagination. Jesus was emptying himself. Jesus saw that he had an opportunity to shift all of the focus, to shift all of the story away from the two most powerful people around, himself and Jairus, and move it to the least powerful person. And all of a sudden, she was the center of what God was doing. All of a sudden, she got to tell her story. I love the way in the Gospel of Mark it says, and she got to tell her story. It was about her. Jesus understood that he had a platform, he had a voice, he had influence. And he recognized that, and he knew that this woman didn't, and so he shifted everything because he could. And she was healed that day, but I think her identity was healed even more than her body that day, because for once she was the center of what was happening. She was the one that people were including in their story of what it meant to be part of the family of God. And the good thing is Jesus still went and healed Jairus' daughter too, because Jesus loves everyone, even privileged people too. That's the beautiful thing about the family of God is there's room for everyone. There's space for everyone. There's no, we don't have to have a perspective of scarcity around God's love and God's power. And so I think about that and I think, gosh, that's the kind, I can wrap my head around that, those sorts of interactions. What does it look like for me as someone who has influence in society, as someone who has privilege, someone who society accommodates? What does it look like for me to empty myself in a way that Jesus did so that I can truly be one? And for me, it's meant, there are lots of things that it's meant, but one thing it's meant is listening well. And like going back to the social psychology, we are so motivated to interpret things in ways that make us feel good. And so even when we claim to be listening to the stories of others, even when we claim, when we show up to say, tell me your perspective as a fish, tell me what's hard about being a fish, tell me what's causing your struggle, my first instinct is to explain it away in a way that makes me feel good, because I have these self-serving biases, right? I don't want them to say anything that implicates me. I don't want them to say, actually, you're part of the problem because you benefit from this system that hurts me. And you might not even be specifically hurting me, but the fact that you benefit from it hurts me. And the fact that you're not standing in solidarity with me hurts me. Another thing I've found that makes it difficult for me to listen well is that, again, because of my ego, I want to fix it. So I might listen for about 5 minutes and be like, yeah, that sounds terrible. But then I will just jump in like the monkey and try to fix it. And one thing I've learned in living in solidarity and living in community with folks who have experienced the world in much more oppressive spaces than I have is that typically my motivation to fix their problems has to do with my discomfort with the reality that they're suffering. It's still completely about me. Completely about me. I'm uncomfortable with a world in which some people are suffering. So I want to fix it. And because I have, friends who are attorneys and friends who are superintendents of schools and all the other things that people like me have access to, I can just say, oh, don't worry, I'm going to make a phone call and I'll fix it. But then I have to go back to Jesus, who spent 30 years on this earth, standing in the ditch of humanity with us before he did anything to fix it. And Jesus came to fix it on some level. And I wonder, what was Jesus doing? Was he listening? Was he experiencing the world on our terms so that when the time came, he actually could be one with us in working towards a different world, a better reality? I'll stop there and we can have some conversation.
Wow, I wish you wouldn't. You are a good teacher. Why, that's brilliant. I love it when people can put together good theology and good psychology. It connects on the human and the divine level, and you do it very well. Thank you. What a privilege. I don't know where to take off. It certainly doesn't need any elaboration, but what came to my mind is something that I taught in this room a lot to our living school students. Might be a way of certainly validating and affirming and leading even a little further the beauty of what you said. Because I think most of, at least I can only critique the Christian world, but most of Christian morality has been almost entirely oriented toward the individual, to make the individual feel guilty or at fault, you know. And you wonder why we have low self-esteem, you know, of course. And the scenario I share with the students, it seems to be helpful, I didn't know I'd have a chance to say this today, is I went back to the old traditional Catholic moral theology, which talked about the three sources of evil. And they said the three sources of evil in this order are the world, that's what you were just talking about, the flesh, where we put all of our energy and concentration, and the devil. Now, I'll define each one of those, probably different than you'd imagine, but you perfectly illustrated the truth of that. Hardly any of us were given any sociological analysis, which is what we mean by the world. That the real reason people do stupid, sinful, evil things is they're in a structural setting that tells them to do it or tells them it's okay, you know. The example many of you have heard me use is in all my years as a confessor in the Catholic Church, I have never once had a Catholic confess to me a sin against the 10th commandment. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's goods. It would never enter an American's mind that that's a sin because it's called capitalism. Do you understand? We've all agreed that it's not a sin. We structurally live inside of coveting everything in sight. It's a business. It's called Madison Avenue. Covet, covet, covet. Created covetousness. I mean, we've got to be told these. Now, we could go through a whole list of things like that, you know. On the individual level, we tell the person they should not have these desires, but in fact, corporately, we say we need to have them to keep the whole thing going. Same is true of thou shalt not kill. You know, you first got to critique it on the corporate national level. In fact, America's wars till Vietnam were always good wars. We idealize killing. And in fact, they get monuments in the center of town for killing. And then the individual person is told they shouldn't kill, to come back on the streets and you shouldn't do that, you're a bad person, and we fill our prisons with the people who are doing this. This is the schizophrenia that our morality is in, all right? Because we didn't do what you just did. To say first source of evil is you got to do cultural analysis of what does the culture agree upon is good or is idealized or is bad. We didn't, well, you can correct me, or did we start doing that maybe the middle of the last century, I guess, on any...
Yeah, I think social psychology has helped with that, but it's a young discipline.
Yeah, a young
it's
discipline.
Less than 100 years old. Yeah.
So we put all of our analysis on the second level, the flesh. The individual nastiness, the individual unworthiness, the individual sinfulness of you, and we all felt dutifully guilty about it, I guess. Until recently, we don't even feel that anymore. I think because we saw the disconnect that we're playing two sides of it. We corporately agree upon most things. Lust is good. It sells almost everything, but you individually should not be lustful. And after a while, the whole thing falls apart. Now, I suspect, you're all waiting, when do we get to the devil? What's this third level, right? And this always shocks the students, so it'll take me a moment, but you are already moving into it. So first, there's the agreed upon evil that it's not evil. In fact, it's good. Greed is good in America. Consumerism is good. Collecting and achieving and hoarding is good. And then the second level, as I said, at the level of the flesh, we say it's wrong. Now, what's the devil? I'm not here to make a theological statement. If you believe in a physical devil with a red tail and a pitchfork, that's okay. Really, it is. It's not going to be real helpful because you could say, we need to personify evil or we don't take it seriously. So I can understand why almost all the religions of the world have done that. But the way we understand the devil in the moral theology I was taught, if the first level is denied and disguised evil, the world, the devil is sanctified evil. Now stay with me. In fact, we just created a word in 2008 for the third level. It's called too big to fail. Right? Things that are too big to fail. And I've got to list them, You can't imagine the world without them, They're utterly sanctified, idealized. You get awards for doing them. As Thomas Aquinas and other of our saints said, the only way evil can get away as evil is to disguise itself as virtue, to disguise itself as good. Now, I'm not saying, I know I'm going to shock some of you, that everybody involved in these institutions is evil. I'm not saying that at all. But I'm saying there's a structural sanctification of evil that we all agree, let's not look at it. Let's not critique it. That critique certainly only started in the 60s. The penal system, the military-industrial complex, right? The banking system, the judicial system, which again, anybody who's one of the fish knows that all of these systems are biased. But you're not supposed to talk about it because we need him. We need the devil. The devil is in the details. This agreed upon sanctified institutions that we cannot imagine our country without. And I can't either. I'm not so naive. You think I'm going to go toward a Bernie Sanders talk right now, I'll bet. I think we're stuck with them. But if you aren't given the eyes to critique those, and that's what you're giving us, to critique the first level and the third level, to see the world and the devil as I've defined them. We will continue, I think, on the same course we're on already. The function of religion is largely to make you feel guilty about your private sinfulness. I don't know what good this has done the world. Really, I don't. And we finally have to ask, and of course I share your Christian theology, and deeply believe that God is saving history. God is saving humanity. And once we move this all to an individual level, that you had to be perfectly worthy, and you had to be perfectly worthy, and you and me, I think that's why most people have given up on it, because they know it's impossible. When you buy and in fact worship, that's not much of an exaggeration, the world and the devil. There's none of this social analysis. People just got tired and felt oppressed by feeling all the time individually guilty, which helps nobody. So I had no idea I was going to go that direction, but I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, can I just riff off that? Okay. Yeah. So something that's so interesting that you just said is this, the blindness to these institutions. I would add more institutions to that.
There's a few
the Christian
more.
Missions Complex or
the medical system.
Yeah, or volunteerism. I mean, so much of what we do, which is actually hurting, it's participating in the evil, is because so many of us feel this like low level or even high level shame all the time, which sometimes is induced by religion, but sometimes I think it's just induced by our like pressure cooker society, is that we are unwilling to hear the voices of people who are actually critiquing, who actually can experience the ways that those institutions are hurting them. And that's kind of what I was getting at when I was talking about listening well, how it starts with listening well. But because of our ego, because we already feel bad about ourselves, we don't want to hear that that we benefit from the penal system, that we benefit from capitalism, that we benefit from that actually the work that we think we're doing to do good is actually hurting more people, the ways that we might infiltrate neighborhoods and try to fix things there, or the ways that we might go on a missions trip or something like that and try to fix things. So when we get that feedback, first of all, we usually insulate ourselves so we don't even get that feedback. I mean, unless you know, for example, unless you personally know a 16-year-old black boy, you probably don't know what it's like to be viewed as a threat all the time by the police, to be viewed as bad, to be viewed to be stopped and frisked regularly. Right? I mean, so even our own homogeneity will often insulate us from even hearing the stories that shine light on the ways that these institutions are evil. But even more often than not, when we hear those stories, we'll try to silence them and say, oh, you probably just deserved it, or you were probably up to no good, or something like that. Or if we do kind of hear it, that's when we go try to fix it. Okay, well then our whole church is going to just invade your neighborhood and fix it. And that's just the monkey ultimately killing the fish, at the very least dishonoring the image of God in the fish, in the fish's agency and the fish's story. And this all comes out of a protection of our ego. I mean, this is why people get so defensive when I say something like there's so many wonderful sociology and psychology studies that show that if you're white, you just benefit from things in our world. Like if you have a white sounding name, you're twice as likely to get called in for an interview than if you have a black sounding name. And it's so hard for people to hear that. And it's because we're so defensive. Our ego is so tied up in protecting ourselves. And so no one wants to hear, wait, you mean I'm twice as likely to get called in for an interview because my name is Emily instead of Lakeisha? That can't be true. Except for it is. And we can't actually deconstruct or critique capitalism or racism or other institutions if we aren't honest. Yeah. And we certainly can't be one if we're not honest. Yeah.
It is, I think for all of us, it's hard to hear because none of us sit or stand on a pedestal of purity. Guilt is equally shared. We're all benefiting from injustice. We're all benefiting from illusions. And that's the real point of even this moral analysis, and I gave you a very brief overview of it. It's not to make you feel guilty, but to situate guilt inside of a context and to let you know there's no pure people and there's no, we're all victims of a system we've agreed. Well, I don't know if we agreed. We probably didn't have any choice. We just found ourselves born here in a world that is highly flawed. And that's probably why the early church came up with this phrase that isn't in the Bible, original sin. They were trying to give a word. Now, the trouble is, and you already centered in on that too, by putting the problem right at the beginning and centering on the problem, and the only purpose of Jesus was to solve the problem. We made him into a fixer, just as you're saying, where he's a transformer. He reveals the problem and says, you know what? The only way to fix it is, in fact, to absorb the absurdity of it and thus transform it. Hold it, as the two arms of the cross try to reveal. Hold it until it takes a new shape in you. This weekend I was calling that the reordered life. The fix-it mode has not served us well because it's made us think we could or we should. And so religion became, well, you heard me say that this weekend too, more transactional than transformational. And if you look at most of the salvation theories, whatever denomination you grew up with, most of the explanations, if you were Catholic, of the sacraments, let's say, they were all transactional. They really weren't. Once in a while they transform people, but I've been a priest 46 years, and there isn't a high correlation between the people who've gone through the Catholic sacraments, that they're appreciably less racist, less capitalist. I hope some of them are, but the statistics don't seem to say so. That we're really transformed people. Now, I'm not saying that's anybody's fault, but when you just concentrate evil on the second level, without the kind of analysis you're giving us, you end up defeating people. And I mean, the amount of people who've left Christianity in the last 40 years is rather understandable, it seems, because they're saying, hey, the transactions aren't working. They're not making me into a loving person. They're not making me into a reconciling person. The department you work with at Duke is?
The Divinity School.
Divinity School, but isn't it specifically for the work of reconciliation?
Yeah, that's my area is reconciliation.
Yeah. And you see that all through this book if you're lucky enough to read it. So we got our work cut out for us. Can you see why we entitled Reimagining the whole thing? If you're hearing us, certainly if you're hearing Christena, this is not cosmetic surgery. Do you understand? And I, for me, if I can just throw this in on the side, some of you know it's become a major theme of mine in recent years, but for me, the basic fly in the ointment that we as Christians have to deal with is that as long as we continue to define our God as a punitive God of retributive justice, then you've got to know that punitiveness and domination and punishment goes all the way down. God has legitimated punishing people. God has legitimated excluding people. And our whole doctrine of a punitive God who, if you don't like him, apparently gets very pissed off. And so pissed off that he will burn you for all eternity. I've got to make it graphic because this is not going to transform people. Do you understand? It threatens people, and you parents could say it better than I. You might get your kids to conform by threatening them, but you haven't turned their heart into love. And the point of the gospel is to turn the heart into love. And I think this work of reconciliation, until we move toward a world of restorative justice, which is relational. I'm so glad you brought the Trinity in, that God itself is ultimate relationship. And can you feel what a realignment this is going to take? Why I say this is not cosmetic surgery, what we're talking about. To really resituate not just the nature of evil, but how evil is transformed. And at the heart of it for me, and this is why I think we're both committed to good theology, and why good theology still matters, it isn't just an abstraction, is for the vast majority of Christians, we have to redeem their very image of God. Their very image of God. Now you talk about reimagining the future. Now I think grace is achieving that. And we're moving in this direction, but I love work like yours is that you're coming at it with a delicacy and a subtlety that I'm probably not. But that's the only way most people are going to be able to hear it, I think.
Yeah, well, I think, this work really only comes out of a very rich understanding of who God is, because Paul's metaphor for the body of Christ is just a human way of understanding the Trinity, really, that interdependence, that mutuality, the different perspectives. So, Paul's kind of calling us to this ministry of reconciliation where the hand is in deep relationship with the foot and is dependent upon the foot and understands that the foot has a different perspective on the world, but still values the foot's perspective, because if if the hand doesn't stay connected to the body, it atrophies. And really, that's just like a very human way of thinking about the Trinity and the ways that the different perspectives and identities and strengths of the Trinity only work when they're in relationship with each other and there's a mutuality there. And so taking that model, applying it, as Paul does, to the family of God, but then as those of us who are reconcilers can apply to to all of humanity, regardless of whether people identify with Christian faith or not, is this idea of mutuality. And so it's really starting with understanding who God is, and that God is relationship at heart, and not just relationship, not transactional relationship, but interdependent mutual relationship. And I wonder, like if the monkey had actually, it forces us to rethink our understanding of evil, our understanding of the way that God, knowledge of God is transmitted, but also it really forces us to reevaluate our geography. Because if the monkey had actually been in relationship with the fish, if the monkey in mutual relationship, not just like I'm going to save you from a distance, or but really if the monkey had any humility and had been in relationship with the fish, the monkey might have been thinking, the fish might be able to save me. I can only be truly alive in relationship with the fish. It's not about me saving the fish. And even that approach, taking it that way, even for those, this is what non-dual thinking is, right? It's this idea that we can be one and we can need each other, even the ones that we think are wrong, even the ones that we think that we don't like, even though, we're all interconnected. So.
It's, I'm so glad we've both moved in this direction, probably not even expecting it, but if God is relationship, then do you see how this levels the playing field even of the world religions? I'll take two Hindus who are in honest relationship any day over two Catholics who just go through the motions and relate to nothing except in a domination way.
From a distance.
This rearranges, and why the image of God is so important. Relationality is what brings things to wholeness. In the beginning is the relationship. That I'm filled with this now because I just finished the book on the Trinity. But once you say that the shape of reality, and I don't know if you notice this, a lot of Catholics who don't read the Bible very much, I'm sad to say, never were told this, but in the first chapter of Genesis, did you note that the plural is used? That Yahweh says, let us create in our image. And we've always wondered, why did Genesis say, let us create in our image? And now you look, the atom is entirely relationship. The galaxies are all relationship. And people who are mass murderers are invariably people outside of relationship. So it doesn't matter in some ways what words you use for the other member, but can you treat them with respect? Can you give them dignity? Can you allow them agency? That was a great word you used.
And to influence you.
And that it comes back this way. I say in the book that what a saint does, I wish I could say I was there, is someone who relates center to center. Center to center. And that might be the whole work of conversion your whole life, to find your center and to honor the center in the other person. When you don't do that, that's why racism still is around at the highest levels of Christianity. That's why classism, homophobia, all these other isms, these demons that have been getting away with not looking like demons, because they're sanctified. They're called purity codes, Don't touch the unworthy people. Stay away from the unworthy people.
Yeah, and just one little thing to add to that is my research on the self and research that others have done on the self shows that the self literally expands in close relationship with the other. And so when we, and I would specifically say equal relationship too, which is why it's so important to address some of these structural inequities, because it really only makes sense in the context of equal relationship, like in the Trinity, but where there's an equality that defines the connection from center to center. But when that happens, the self expands. And so once I'm in close relationship with someone, I'm including their perspective, their strengths, their weaknesses, their pains, their joys in my calculation of my understanding of myself. So much so that if you ask me, what do you care about right now? What they care about is what I care about. What are you happy about? Well, what they're happy about is what I'm happy about. So that individualism starts to break down. This happens in close relationships, also happens in strong group memberships. And so it becomes very natural to share resources, to share time. Our story gets wrapped up in their story. And
Brilliant.
It actually is a very natural process. I mean, we see it all the time with, happily married couples, or, so you can imagine how this would work. But that oneness happens on a self level.
Mm-hmm. See what you're saying it so perfectly. In other words, our morality comes from who we are and who God is. Mm-hmm. Whereas what most of us were trained to think was, if we are moral, we will come to be acceptable to God. Mm-hmm. And what I think we're both trying to do without saying it is, if you live in right relationship, you will do the moral thing. Mm-hmm. Morality is a corollary. It's an effect. Mm-hmm. Once you know about the nature of center-to-center relationship, or what Martin Buber would call the I-thou relationship, of course you're not going to lie to people. Of course you're not going to steal. Of course you're not going to kill. But I'll tell you the way I was raised as a little Catholic boy, don't you steal, don't you lie, don't you kill. And if you hold out for that for 20 years, maybe God will begin to love you. Do you understand? Or maybe you'll know God. We are notorious for putting the cart before the horse, And I guess we're trying to put turn it the other way around. Do we want to open it up to let folks here or at home? Thank you for sticking with us this long. I know this is heavy stuff, but it's a delight to have a partner in crime. I don't have to do it all by myself.
Yeah, thank you. That was wonderful. Lots of questions. One from George from Liverpool. Actually, I'm kidding. It's me, but I don't want to take advantage of both of you.
George from Liverpool.
The way that you described, Christena, the act of that deep listening and attentiveness to your own discomfort in that listening, we talk a lot here about the importance of cultivating a contemplative practice, that really our way of perceiving, our basic operating system doesn't know anything other than reaction from the egoic self without literally practicing putting on a new mind. And I wonder if you could, both of you unpack that just a little bit. How could we imagine the way that we engage with each other as actually a form of contemplative practice?
Wow.
Yeah, I think for me, contemplative practices help me to focus on what's right at hand, but with a frame of mind that that moves me away from the ego and from seeking to protect my ego. And I know I've been in deep relationship and lived with folks who are just identify with incredibly oppressed groups. And more often than not, I'll come home from work, which in and of itself is stressful, a busy day, and then we'll get critiqued in maybe not the nicest ways about the ways in which I'm contributing to their oppression, either by being flippant about something that's a real pain for them, or not listening well, or simply because I represent the group of people who don't have to deal with their oppression. And so I've found that the practice for me is to walk into those, and they're oftentimes not planned conversations with in my mind, thinking, okay, we're all created in the image of God. We all have dignity in this conversation. I don't have anything to hide. I don't have anything to be ashamed of. And God wants to use, God wants to use my particular location in the world to bring wholeness too. So I'm not disqualified from being part of the family, a part of the solution, but it's a very, it's difficult when you're getting cursed out at the same time. Yeah, for good reason, right? I mean,
yes.
Anger is, but I also think of it contemplatively too, because anger for me is sacred. And if someone, particularly someone who identifies with an oppressed group, is expressing their anger towards me, whether it's specifically at me or people like me, I see that as a sacred moment, because I know, as someone who identifies with some oppressed groups, that I typically don't express my anger to people unless I kind of sort of trust them, because it's so intimate. And so I also just sort of I'm going to learn something, and this is a very powerful moment that I can lean into. And I see that as contemplative in that way too.
You know, if I understood the question, it's a very good one. And you're George from Liverpool. Yeah. I think that's the goal, and this will probably offend some people who think sitting is the point of prayer. I think sitting is the discipline whereby you learn to be present. Mm-hmm. But the goal is standing and walking and, not... the purpose of history can't be for everybody to have 2 20-minute sits every day. Do you understand? What are mothers supposed to do? Yeah. Come on. Now, I don't want to be flippant either. Until you've learned the art of recognizing the games your mind plays, you probably won't be able to do it while you're mothering. Yeah. So I would still affirm it as a necessary discipline for many years of life. You'll let yourself get away with murder while not calling it murder, because you take your thinking as normative, and you take your ego as the center, the reference point. So, but yeah, there's nothing wrong with saying that the interactions of right relationship are contemplative, to maintain them, to maintain your center, even when someone has just spoken unkindly to you. How else that's the goal. That's where we want to get. Not to assure everybody that we're still doing our 20-minute sit.
So we've got one from Paul from Minnesota about the political context that we're in currently, and the role of recognizing kind of the psychological nature of our biases and our prejudices and the way that we experience them in the world. How do we also understand the need to participate consciously in a political climate that is profoundly divided in both, I think, in the, I'm adding commentary here, but the national electoral context, but even in the context of active social movements like Black Lives Matter that have arisen in recent years.
Where do you start, huh?
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
It's a huge cultural... one thing quickly comes to mind, I won't take long with this, but I'm told that in the last 20 years, more and more people just read their own magazines and follow their own social media sources. So we're finding that people are unduly affirmed in their biases. If you only listen to Fox News,
MSNBC.
Or MSNBC. You get hardened in your position and really think it's the only position. I certainly think that's contributed to it, yeah.
Yeah, I wrote about this recently. So I think there are two things that those of us who want to be bridge builders can do. One is to practice humility as we interact with the other group. So again, the sociological imagination, recognizing our biases. If you look at research, it's really culturally predictable where people are going to land politically. So this idea that we're individuals who think for ourselves is like so false. It's just a myth. We're actually programmed to think the way that we do based on who we are interacting with. And so I think some humility around that, just to say, but then going back to the mutuality, there's something about the other side that I could learn from, that I actually have to be open to learning from, or else I can't truly be human, would I think help a lot in this particular climate, even if we're just doing it on individual levels with our neighbors. But I will say particularly when there are power differences and there's a division, so like for example, Black Lives Matter versus the sort of broader US society, or when there are issues where again, going back to the monkey and the fish, recognizing that there is a power difference, that some people have more of a voice, some people are seen as more rational, some people are seen as more moral than other people, and that this plays a role in who's silenced and who is oppressed in our society, then I say we turn our ear faster and longer to the voices of those who are part of that group that has less power. So it's not all divisions are not created equal, is what I'm saying. So when there is an equality between the groups that are at war with each other, I say yes, that humility of let's listen to each other, let's try to be mutual. But when there's a power difference, we give preference, we give an extra credibility to the group that has not been given that by society.
We should give.
We should,
Yes.
That's what listening well means, right?
I think that's the gospel too.
Yeah.
We call it the preferential option for the poor. That you have to choose that side, because otherwise the other side always has dominance.
And the other side gets to decide what's moral, and gets to tone police and gets to do all sorts of things to continue to discredit the other side, to discredit the group that has less power. And so,
Thank you. One from Daniel Mendoza. Feel free to opt out of this question if you'd like, but how do you think the modern church might be, in some part, contributing to that third level of evil as sanctified evil?
In Mark's gospel, I'm sure you know this, the first demon is discovered in the synagogue, right? And I didn't mention it, but I should. I would have to put religion on the demonic level. Now, that must shock you terribly. but the greater light you have, as Jung said, the greater shadow you can cast. And so here I am, a man of religion. Christena is too. Religion is the best thing in the world, but it's the worst thing in the world. The corruption of the best is the worst. And that's why you better be careful with tampering with religion, because it's the best hiding place the ego can have. To feel sanctified, remember that's the demonic level, everything is sanctified. Well, that's our whole business, is to sanctify things. So do you see, there was actually a study, I don't know if you heard this, I don't know how many years ago it was, but they took all the different professions in society and judged them on the narcissism scale. Clergy were number one. That's the most narcissistic group. When you walk around and people are kissing your hand and calling you reverend and father, if you haven't done your spiritual work, that's a dangerous position. So I'm just affirming it. It's true.
Yeah, the Western modern church certainly is so held captive by Western culture that it's so far from who Jesus really was and what Jesus talked about. And so much work on cultural psychology and religion shows that Christians in North America are so individualistic and so capitalistic, and it's so intertwined with our faith that we can't even see that. But you don't see that in other parts of the world, especially to the extent that they haven't, that we haven't outsourced our Christianity to them. So there are cultural differences. Yeah.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Nicholas here in the U.S. So beyond the individual listening, not fixing, learning to be present, center to center, Do you have examples of where you see that kind of reconciliation happening on a systemic level that is particularly hopeful?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I've seen it in institutions. So I would call that systemic, but not necessarily like broader societal. But I've certainly seen like entire churches go on this journey together. I've seen academic institutions and nonprofits go on this journey together. So absolutely, it requires a lot of death first. So much of the culture, because the culture in those institutions tend to be so white, so male, so Western, so individualistic. They have to divest themselves of all of those things so much so that they almost seem unrecognizable. But once they go on that journey, some really just unbelievably beautiful things happen. And I've worked with about 15 different organizations specifically on this journey, and no one's ever wanted to go back, even though it's come at great cost.
You know, the group that is obvious to me coming from the Catholic world is the religious sisters. There's hardly a community in America of religious women, and I emphasize women, because you don't hear these statements from the men. We're too much a part of the patriarchal system of the church. But there's hardly a sisters community that has not written the most honest, radical critiques of everything, you know. And I think they had several advantages. First, they lived in community where the discernment went on, and they listened to the gospel together and discussed the gospel. But secondly, I think the fact that they were women, and therefore were in that oppressed position even inside the church, where we men had all the power, and they didn't. So they read it from the underside. And as you know, when I was growing up, sisters in full costume, as it were very idealized and thought to be naive and harmless. Well, you know, it's exactly the opposite now, right? The Vatican itself is terrified of American nuns, you know, because they are the truth speakers like few other groups can do. And they also know they have their community to back them up if they do go to jail or whatever else it might be, and a lot of them have in the last years. It's a wonderful testimony to the power of community and hearing the gospel in community where you know you're not crazy. Because you, all on your own, you're afraid you're going to be a liberal, or you're afraid, I don't know what you're going to, or heretic. But if you got a discerning community that backs you up, I mean, I've always been lucky to have that as a Franciscan, and some reason I can get away with the things I say, because I've got a community backing me up, and it's not just Richard talking.
So we've got a question from our studio audience here from Maureen, related to that, what you just described, Dr. Cleveland, about the institutions that you've taken through that journey. Just what specific steps did that actually involve for them?
So a couple of things. One, our society is designed for stratification. Our society is designed for us to only hang out with people who are just like us. And then our human nature is designed, our psychology is designed to, once we find a group, really feel good about our group and protect our group from any critique or really anything that might threaten the group. So oftentimes these are institutions that have been influenced by these societal and psychological forces, and so they end up being an all something church. It could be all white, could be all black, could be all wealthy, could be but definitely a homogenous church, and a church that has built-in self-defenses. In the same way that we defend our sense of self, we have these self-serving biases, we have group-serving biases too, because myself is closely related to my group. So if I want to feel good about myself, I want to feel even better about my group, because that protects my sense of self. And so the process is really critical self-examination, oftentimes bringing in outside folks to really tell you how white and male and racist you are or whatever. And then actually hearing that, and then there's a long period of repentance and mourning over that, because once we realize how broken we are, and how far we are from the imagined way, the better way, that should lead to some pretty significant lament. But then it also involves actually changing our structures. So, to give an example of a church, really changing the type of preaching that's being done, changing the type of other forms of teaching, the service. What are the sorts of things that we think are faithful, but really are just cultural? Like, what are the things that we like? What's our circumcision, right? Like, what is our thing that is very cultural, but we want to make sure that everyone else has to do it too, and looking and evaluating all of the processes, the programs, the ideas, the types of interactions, the types of people who thrive in this environment. Who are those people, and how are others being excluded? And that, it's a very intense sort of sociological process. And at every step of the way, there's death, because the culture has to keep dying. And this is a culture that's been feeding its ego forever, right? Which is why, institutions that have been around longer than a generation have a really, really hard time changing, because their DNA is set. It's not impossible, but it's effortful.
Wow. Thanks. Question from Lisa. It's maybe particularly personal. How can the monkey get beyond his or her shame about what he or she did to the first fish, so that the monkey can get to know and be in relationship with another fish?
Yeah. I think that's where contemplation, contemplative practices really come into place, because because it's something that I'm just thinking, it's very personal, because I've done that myself so many times, and I'm trying to think of how I get past it. It's really sitting in God's love. It's the time spent, and you do it every day, and then one day there's a switch, and you're able to accept yourself, and you're able to keep going. Because, and I think for me too, it's a recognition that shame is just not going to help anything. Too, so it's sort of that pragmatic one. But I think it's the contempt, because you can't talk yourself out of that. You can't, especially if you take it seriously, and it really, if you did make that center to center connection, it should feel like death to you. But I think it's through the contemplative practices that we get back to resurrection.
I can't get any. It sounds so simple that people think you're avoiding an answer, but it really is the answer. Thank you.
The last thing we need is people, and I've done this too, which is why I really think the contemplative practices are so powerful, especially for fixers like me, the last thing we need is someone like me going out, doing my work out of shame or fear. Or self-righteousness, because I'll either get defensive about what I did, or I'll feel ashamed about what I did, or I'll be afraid of what I did. And either way, that's not love, right? So I have to wait until I get to a place of love so I can keep going. And sometimes that takes 6 months. Sometimes it takes a week. It just depends.
Beautiful.
Thank you. So another one from our studio audience. You may have touched a nerve describing the Christian mission complex as sanctified evil. Can you talk about, unpack that a little bit in terms of what's evil about it, and what are examples of how to do it in a way that's actually helpful?
Particularly the institution of religion.
Well, the mission complex, the participation in voluntourism, or those kinds of activities in particular that are dedicated to helping people, ostensibly.
What we're really talking about is danger. We're not saying evil, but most evil is done when it's done without any critique. So we plant the word of watch it. Be careful. You can do the right thing for the wrong reason. And an uncritiqued virtue is usually sin. That's one reason I taught the Enneagram for so many years, that it helped people see that the very thing they idealized in themselves, their Enneagram number, if you want to use that language, in fact makes them make their worst mistakes. It's just, there's no other tool I know that helps us see that. So it's not naming it objectively evil. It's that you can do evil without calling it evil, and so be careful. It's sort of putting a caution sign. So you don't idealize, especially, and I guess that's the heroic, sanctimonious things, because those are the ones that the ego will most grab onto. That I am helping the poor, or I am going on a mission trip, or I'm celibate, or I'm a nun, or I'm a mother. The more sanctified it is, the more publicly I'm a veteran. All of them. See, I'm not supposed to say those things. Those are the most dangerous ones of all for the ego. Do you understand? And that's why the prostitute, the drunkard, and the tax collector always appear to be getting the point in the Gospels, because they aren't hiding behind it. They know they're not sanctified. Got it? That actually gives them a head start. But any of us who hold any roles or costumes or titles, I got loads of them, you know. We live in the most dangerous position of all. Most dangerous. And it has to be warned against, because I think it's controlled religion in the West for most of its history, you know. Well, not being exposed because it's sanctified. You know, you don't question the bishop. And now we see what happened to our bishops, just to bring it home, you know. You can't live uncritiqued. So we're planting in your hearts and your minds not an angry critique, but a contemplative, calm critique that can see where evil really hides and where evil often really lies and succeeds, while not being called evil. That's the third level, got it? In fact, called virtue. Yeah.
And to add to that, when powerful people do anything without undergoing very significant reflection, contemplation, awareness, distance from ego practices, we tend to oppress. That's what happens when you experience the world differently than the vast majority of the rest of the world. We're like the monkey. It doesn't matter how good our intentions are. And so, you know, me including the Christian missions complex in this evil was because, like Father Richard said, so much of what's done, particularly in short-term missions, is still about the ego, and it's not self-reflective. And because so much of our culture, so much of Christianity, Western Christianity, is held captive to Western culture, we can't even see the ways that we're exporting things that aren't about God in ways that are really dishonoring and not based in mutuality. And so, yeah, it's something that's worth critiquing.
A one-liner that sure makes that point. I think it's St. Vincent de Paul, who we associate with caring for the poor. And he's supposed to have said to his Vincentians, his followers, you know, every day before you go out to help the poor, pray that the poor will forgive you for helping them.
Yeah.
Just to make that power equation clear, you know. Pray that the poor will forgive you for helping them. It's subtle, but I think you can get it now. It's there's a giving that, in fact, well, you said it, oppresses. I maintain I'm the nice white rich woman who's helping you poor slob, you know, and they remain a slob and I remain the nice white woman, you know, or white man, you know.
Yeah, and then the really powerful thing that social psych research shows is that it doesn't have to be that conscious, and it doesn't have to be that harsh. Like you don't have to consciously think, I'm helping this poor slob. There are ways that we infrahumanize, which is like a very subtle form of dehumanization, where we essentially, what we do is we ascribe uniquely human characteristics to our group not even mentioning the other group, but the implication is that the other group doesn't have it. So, for example, like we infrahumanize by saying, well, we're looking at this rationally. Whereas higher order cognitive processing is uniquely human, right? We have these huge prefrontal cortexes, and that distinguishes us from other animals. So, we might say something like that, or we might say things like, if I had been on welfare for 10 years, I'd feel guilty. You don't even have to say that person's a slob. You've just said that person's a slob. Mm-hmm. And so it's a very subtle way because guilt and shame are moral emotions. They're uniquely human, right? If you don't feel guilt and shame, you're like a sociopath. And so like these are the ways that it's so subtle how much our ego gets padded and boosted as we're even supposedly helping people, as we're supposedly fixing things. And so, every once in a while you're going to find a jerk who will call someone a slob to their face, but that doesn't take that. And research shows that just by infrahumanizing, just by ascribing uniquely human characteristics to ourselves, even if we don't even mention the other group, we see a self-esteem boost, like an actual tangible increase in our self-esteem.
Wow. Maybe the last question here from Robert from Taiwan. He says, I'm bothered by St. Paul's words. Let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others. And do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other. From Philippians and Corinthians. What is the message of these words to people who live in a highly competitive culture focused on self-advancement?
I guess you wonder if we even see that as a problem. Probably we wouldn't. Maybe there's a few heroic people who do that, but the normal exchange rate in our culture is we assume competition, don't we? We assume that I've got to make more than you, look better than you. What were the scripture quotes he used again? Do you have them there?
Let me get him back here.
Hello, Robert, by the way, and Taiwan. I know this man.
From Philippians 2:4, let each of you look not to your own interests, but to the interests of others.
Oh, yeah.
And from 1 Corinthians 10:24, do not seek your own advantage, but that of the other.
It's a major turnaround, isn't it? Altruism. Yeah.
Well, what I love is Paul here is really providing a pathway to freedom for privileged people.
Wow.
Because he's talking about, especially in the Philippians passage, he's talking about in the context of Trinitarian love. I mean, that Philippians 2:1 is all about the love of the Trinity. And then Paul goes on to say, if you get this love, then you won't do so I think he's connecting the two, saying that, letting go of this game, which is really just a game, will lead you to the type of mutuality that we see exemplified in the Trinity, and that's where it's at. So I say it's medicine for us. If we can at least slowly start moving in that direction. That's the whole point. We need it. Yeah. He's trying to help us save ourselves.
We're helping them. Yeah. Well put.
Yeah.
Wow. Boy, this is reimagining Christianity, isn't it? I'm not living it yet, but I can't deny the truth of it, and I want to live it.
Same here. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Dr. Cleveland, for being our guest, and thank you, Father Richard, for this conversation, for this very rich challenge for all of us to learn how to love more deeply, more effectively, amidst a very divided world in which we all participate today. And thanks to our studio audience and to our guests all around the world for joining us tonight, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Good. Bye. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.